It was a late autumn afternoon in the small, sleepy town of Oak Ridge. The kind of town where everyone knew each other's business, where secrets lingered only as whispers. 12-year-old Amara Bennett walked home alone, her backpack swinging as she hummed softly to herself. She always took the shortcut through Dawson Park, though her father had told her many times to avoid it. "Nothing good ever happens there," he'd say with a stern look. But Amara was stubborn and thought the warning was just her father being overprotective. The park was half empty, littered with dry leaves. Tall trees stretched shadows across the cracked pavement as the light faded. Amara didn't notice the group of boys until they stepped into her path. There were 4 of them, maybe 5, teenagers, older, stronger, and far less friendly. Their voices carried the sharp edge of mockery. "Hey, little girl," one sneered, tall and lanky, his dirty blonde hair falling over his eyes. "Where you headed in such a hurry?" Amara's steps faltered. She gripped her backpack straps tightly, keeping her gaze forward. Her father had taught her not to engage. "Keep walking, baby girl," his voice echoed in her head. But the boys didn't let her. "Where you going, huh?" another voice said. This one was deep and guttural, accompanied by a shove. Amara stumbled back. Her heart raced as adrenaline surged through her. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. And that was all it took to light the fuse. "Feisty, isn't she?" the lanky boy taunted. "What? Think you're better than us?" "No," Amara whispered, tears welling in her eyes. She felt the sting of shame, a humiliation she didn't deserve. But it didn't stop there. The words they hurled at her, slurs, insults, things no child should hear, cut through her like shards of glass. They circled her like wolves, laughing and jeering. Then one of them grabbed her backpack and ripped it from her shoulders, scattering her books onto the dirty pavement. She froze. Time seemed to stretch into an unbearable eternity. She wanted to fight back, to scream for help, but her voice was caught in her throat. Then a voice cut through the chaos. "Amara!" It was a roar. A lion's roar, deep, commanding, and full of fury. The group of boys turned toward the sound. Amara's heart soared with relief as she saw a tall figure striding toward them, his silhouette broad and unmistakable against the dying light. It was her father, James Bennett. James was not the kind of man anyone dared to cross. At 6'3", with shoulders like stone and a gaze as hard as steel, he was a presence that demanded attention. But what made him terrifying in that moment was not his size. It was the look on his face. Pure, unadulterated rage. "What the hell is going on here?" James barked, his voice reverberating through the park. The boys froze. The lanky leader, suddenly far less confident, tried to puff up his chest. We were just messing around. No big deal, man." James didn't let him finish. In 2 powerful strides, he was towering over them. He grabbed the lanky boy by the collar and hoisted him an inch off the ground. "You think bullying a little girl is funny?" James growled, his voice low and dangerous. The boy's face went pale, his bravado crumbling. No, sir," he stammered. James dropped him roughly, and the boy fell back onto his heels. "You will pick up her books," James ordered. "You will apologize, and then you will leave." The boys hesitated for a split second too long. "I said now," James thundered. Scrambling, the teenagers obeyed, their hands shaking as they picked up Amara's books and shoved them clumsily back into her backpack. Each of them muttered a hurried apology, their voices small and weak. James stood unmoving, watching them like a predator as they backed away and then ran off, disappearing into the gloom of the park. Silence settled once they were gone, broken only by the sound of Amara's soft sniffles. James turned to her, his expression softening instantly. He knelt down and gathered her into his strong arms. "It's okay, baby," he whispered. "I'm here. You're safe now." Amara buried her face in her father's shoulder and let the tears fall. She had been so scared, so alone, but her father had come. Like a guardian angel, he had come. James pulled back slightly, holding her face gently in his hands. "Did they hurt you?" he asked, his voice calm but tight with worry. Amara shook her head. "No, just my books." James exhaled a deep breath, brushing her tears away. "Don't worry about the books," he said. "I'll buy you new ones. Let's go home." As they walked out of Dawson Park, James kept one arm around Amara's shoulders. The sky above had darkened, the streetlights flickering to life. Amara glanced up at her father, feeling a surge of something she couldn't quite describe. Gratitude, love, and awe, all wrapped into one. That night, as James tucked her into bed, Amara whispered, "Thank you, Daddy." James kissed her forehead. "Always, baby girl. Always." But as he closed her bedroom door, James lingered in the hallway, his fists clenching. Those boys had gotten off easy. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. James Bennett didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The rage simmered just beneath his calm exterior, a controlled fire threatening to spill over. He replayed the events in Dawson Park over and over again. Amara's tears, the look of fear in her eyes, and those boys' arrogant smirks before they realized who they were dealing with. James had always been a patient man. He believed in teaching his daughter kindness and resilience. He believed in second chances. But tonight, something had snapped inside him. "Mess with me all you want," he muttered to the empty room. "But not my child." The clock on the wall read 3:27 a.m. when James finally moved. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts. There was someone he needed to call, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. He hesitated for only a moment before pressing dial. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was groggy, deep, and unmistakably sharp even in sleep. "Darren," James said. A pause. Then, "James? Damn, man, it's been a minute. What's going on?" James didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need you to find some names for me. There were a group of kids at Dawson Park tonight. They went after Amara." Silence. "Your daughter?" Darren's tone turned deadly serious. "Yes. I want to know who they are, where they live, who their families are." "You sure about this?" Darren asked carefully. "You and I both know this could get messy." James's jaw tightened. "I'm not talking about anything illegal. I just want to have a conversation." Darren snorted. "Right, a conversation. Can you help me or not?" There was no hesitation this time. "I'll text you what I find by morning." James hung up and leaned back in his chair. His hands were steady now. Whatever came next, he was ready for it. Morning light crept through the windows as Amara shuffled into the kitchen, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. James had already made breakfast: pancakes, eggs, and fruit, her favorite. "Morning, sweetheart," James said, his voice soft as he set a plate in front of her. "Morning, Daddy," Amara mumbled. But there was something different about her this morning. She picked at her food, pushing the eggs around with her fork. James sat across from her. "You okay?" Amara shrugged. "I just don't want to go to school today." James's heart clenched. "Why not?" "What if those boys are there?" she whispered. James's expression hardened, though he kept his tone gentle. "Listen to me, Amara. Those boys won't bother you again. I promise." "But how do you know?" "Because I'm your father," he said simply. "And it's my job to protect you." Amara looked up at him, her big brown eyes searching his face for reassurance. She finally nodded and took a bite of her pancakes, though she still seemed distant. James watched her carefully. This wasn't just about what happened in the park. Those boys had taken something from her, her sense of safety, her confidence, and James would be damned if he let them get away with it. By noon, James's phone buzzed with a message from Darren. He opened it quickly, his eyes narrowing as he read. Got your info. Names: Ryan Talbot, ringleader; Mason Green, Kyle Bennett, no relation; and Tyler Rowe. All live near the East End. Addresses attached. Looks like they've been in trouble before. Juvenile records sealed, but word on the street is they're a nasty bunch. Watch your step. James exhaled sharply. He didn't need Darren's warning. He already knew exactly what kind of boys he was dealing with. He grabbed his keys and slipped on his jacket. Amara was in her room reading, completely unaware of the storm brewing outside her door. "I'll be back soon," James called out. "Okay," Amara replied, her voice distant. James stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin, and climbed into his truck. His fists tightened around the steering wheel as he started the engine. He had 4 names, 4 addresses, and 1 mission: to make sure those boys understood exactly what they had done and why it could never happen again. The first house belonged to Ryan Talbot, the lanky blonde who had been the ringleader in Dawson Park. James parked across the street, watching the modest brick house through narrowed eyes. He sat there for a moment, thinking, planning. Then he got out of the truck and walked up the driveway. The doorbell echoed through the house. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a thin woman with weary eyes and a cigarette dangling from her lips. "Yeah?" she said, eyeing James suspiciously. "I'm here to see Ryan," James said, his voice even. The woman frowned. "Who are you?" "I'm the father of the little girl he and his friends bullied last night." The woman's eyes widened slightly. "Ryan!" she shouted over her shoulder. "Get your ass down here!" Heavy footsteps thundered down the stairs, and Ryan appeared, his expression immediately souring when he saw James standing there. "What do you want?" Ryan muttered, slouching against the doorframe. James stepped closer, his towering figure making Ryan shrink back instinctively. "We need to talk," James said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than any shout ever could. Ryan's mother glanced between them, sensing the tension. "Whatever this is, take it outside," she grumbled, retreating into the house. Ryan stepped out onto the porch, his cocky facade slipping under James's unrelenting stare. "You think you're tough?" James asked. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't do anything. We were just messing around." "Messing around?" James's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the danger in it. "You humiliated my daughter. You made her afraid to walk through her own town. That isn't messing around. That's cowardice." Ryan swallowed hard, his bravado fading entirely. "I didn't mean—" "You're going to apologize to my daughter," James interrupted. "In person, today. And you're going to promise her that this will never happen again. Do you understand me?" Ryan nodded quickly. Yeah. Okay. Good." James leaned in, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Because if you or your friends ever look at her the wrong way again, you'll answer to me. And trust me, son, you don't want that." Ryan's face turned pale, and he nodded again. "I get it. I'm sorry." James stared at him for a moment longer, ensuring the message had been received. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his truck. 1 down, 3 to go. James Bennett drove silently through the east end of Oak Ridge, the streets colder and quieter than he'd ever noticed. His hands gripped the wheel firmly, veins tense against his skin. He had dealt with Ryan Talbot, but there were still 3 names left: Mason Green, Kyle Bennett, and Tyler Rowe. In his mind, every step of this was deliberate. He wasn't acting out of blind rage. This wasn't vengeance. It was about making these boys understand the consequences of their actions. If no one else in their lives was going to teach them the meaning of accountability, James would. The next stop was Mason Green. Mason's house was a ramshackle 2-story building with peeling white paint and a crooked porch swing hanging by a single chain. James could hear a dog barking somewhere inside. He parked across the street, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the truck. As James approached, The front door swung open suddenly. A boy with messy dark hair and an ill-fitting hoodie stepped onto the porch. Mason. Mason froze when he saw James approaching. His eyes darted around, like a rabbit sensing a predator. "You know who I am?" James asked, his deep voice carrying across the yard. Mason shifted his weight, mumbling, "Yeah, I know." "Good, then we don't have to pretend." James stopped a few feet away, looming over Mason like a shadow. "Do you know why I'm here?" "I didn't do anything," Mason shot back quickly, but his voice trembled. James stared at him, unblinking. "You and your friends humiliated my daughter. You shoved her, threw her books, called her names I won't repeat. And you think that's nothing?" Mason tried to stand taller, crossing his arms. "It's not like we hit her or something. We were just having fun. You're blowing this out of—" "You call it fun," James said sharply, cutting him off. "She calls it terror, and I call it a line you should have never crossed." Mason looked away, his confidence unraveling under James's gaze. "You're going to apologize to my daughter," James continued, his voice low and steady, "and you're going to do it today. You're going to tell her you were wrong, and you're going to mean it. Do you understand me?" Mason opened his mouth as if to argue, but then closed it again, swallowing hard. Okay, he muttered. "I'll do it." "Louder," James said, his tone firm. "I want to believe you." "I'll do it," Mason said more clearly. James stepped closer, his voice a quiet rumble. "And Mason, listen to me. If I hear that you or those other boys even look at my daughter again, you won't have to worry about her telling me, because I'll be watching. Do you understand?" Mason nodded quickly, his face pale. Yes, sir." "Good." James stared at him for a long moment before turning and walking back to his truck. As he climbed in, he glanced back to see Mason still standing on the porch, shoulders slumped and defeated. James didn't have to look far to find Tyler Rowe. Darren's information said Tyler often hung out at the old skate park near the edge of town. Sure enough, when James pulled into the gravel lot, he saw Tyler sitting on a graffiti-covered bench, a skateboard tossed lazily at his feet. Tyler was smaller than the others, wiry with sharp features and a cocky slouch. When James stepped out of his truck, Tyler glanced up, smirking like he wasn't impressed. "Who are you supposed to be?" Tyler called, leaning back on his elbows. James walked toward him slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel. "I'm Amara Bennett's father." Tyler's smirk disappeared instantly, his posture stiffening. Oh, James echoed darkly, stopping a few feet in front of him. "You know why I'm here, don't you?" Tyler shifted nervously, his bravado crumbling. "Look, man, we were just joking around. It wasn't a big deal. You call scaring a little girl and tearing her books apart joking around?" James's voice was low, steady, and utterly terrifying. Tyler looked away, mumbling, "We didn't think she'd freak out." James crouched down so that he was eye level with the boy. "And now you're going to think about it. You're going to apologize to my daughter today, face to face, and you're going to mean it." Tyler blinked rapidly, clearly trying not to panic. I can't." "You can," James interrupted. "And you will, because if you don't, I'll make sure you do. Do you understand me?" Tyler swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "Yes, sir, I'll apologize. I promise." James didn't move for a long moment, letting the silence hang heavy between them. Finally, he stood up, towering over the boy once more. "Remember, Tyler, this is your chance to make it right. Don't waste it." Tyler nodded again, his face pale and his hands trembling. James turned and walked back to his truck without another word. The final name on James's list was Kyle Bennett. The coincidence of the last name meant nothing to James, but it still left a bitter taste in his mouth. He found Kyle's house tucked away on a quiet street, a modest place with a rusty basketball hoop out front. James knocked on the door, and it was answered by a middle-aged man with tired eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I'm here to see Kyle," James said evenly. "It's about something that happened last night." The man turned and barked, "Kyle, get out here!" Moments later, Kyle appeared, a stocky teenager with shaggy brown hair and a scowl plastered across his face. When he saw James, the scowl faltered. "You know who I am?" James asked. Kyle nodded slowly. "Yeah, Amara's dad." "That's right." James stepped closer, his towering presence making Kyle back up a step. "We're going to settle this right now." Kyle's father frowned. "What's this about?" "Ask your son," James said, not breaking eye contact with Kyle. Kyle's face flushed red. "We didn't mean anything by it." James held up a hand, silencing him. "Kyle, listen to me carefully. You will apologize to my daughter today, in person. And you will promise that this will never happen again." Kyle's father looked between them, realization dawning on his face. "You were bullying a little girl?" he snapped. Kyle mumbled, "I said I didn't mean anything." "That's not good enough," James said sharply. "You don't get to make excuses. You made her feel small. You made her feel scared. And you're going to make it right." Kyle's father grabbed him by the shoulder, glaring. "You'll do exactly what this man says. Get your shoes on. We're going over there now." James stared at Kyle for a moment longer before turning and walking back to his truck. He had set the wheels in motion. The apologies would come, and Amara would see that she wasn't alone, that her father would always stand for her. But James wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about Amara anymore. This was about teaching these boys, and the whole town, that hate had no place here. It was Saturday morning, and Amara Bennett sat curled up on the living room couch with a book in her lap, though she wasn't reading. Her fingers toyed with the frayed edge of the blanket, her thoughts lingering on Dawson Park. She hadn't told her friends what happened. How could she? How could she explain the shame she felt, the helplessness, the way their words still echoed in her ears like a cruel song? She glanced toward the window, watching her father outside, moving with quiet intensity as he worked on the family truck. Even with his face turned away, she could see the tension in his shoulders. He knows what happened. Really hurt me, she thought. Amara loved her father fiercely. He was her anchor, her protector, but she couldn't help feeling like something had shifted since that day. James wasn't talking about it. He hadn't asked her for details. Yet she knew he was carrying it, just as much as she was. Suddenly, the low rumble of the truck's engine turned off, and moments later, the front door opened. James stepped inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "Amara," he said softly, wiping grease from his hands with an old cloth. "You got a minute?" Amara frowned. "What is it?" James sat on the edge of the recliner across from her. "Some people are coming over. A few boys, you know." Amara's heart skipped a beat. The book slipped from her hands, landing on the floor with a soft thud. "What?" James's gaze was steady, warm but firm. "The boys from the park," he said carefully. "They're coming to apologize." Amara stared at him, her chest tight. "You made them come?" James shook his head slowly. "No, baby. I made them understand that they needed to come, that what they did was wrong, and that they owe you an apology." Amara felt her throat close up. "I don't want to see them, Daddy," she whispered. "I don't want to hear what they have to say." James moved to sit next to her on the couch, his large hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I know this is hard," he said softly, "but this is for you, sweetheart, not for them. This is so you can hear them admit they were wrong. So you can hold your head high and know that you didn't deserve any of it. You did nothing wrong." Amara swallowed hard, her eyes filling with tears. "What if they're not sorry?" "They will be," James said, his voice low but certain. By early afternoon, the Bennett home felt unusually quiet. Amara sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped in her lap, as James stood by the window. The sound of car doors slamming shut made Amara jump slightly. James turned to her and offered a reassuring nod. "You've got this, baby girl." The doorbell rang. James opened the door, his towering frame nearly blocking the view. Outside, the four boys stood in a line: Ryan Talbot, Mason Green, Kyle Bennett, and Tyler Rowe. Behind them stood two sets of parents, their expressions a mix of discomfort and disappointment. "Come in," James said simply, stepping aside. The boys shuffled into the living room, each one looking anywhere but at Amara, who sat quietly at the table. Mason's hands were stuffed into his hoodie pockets, while Ryan stood stiffly, his face pale. James closed the door, the sound of the latch echoing like a judge's gavel. He motioned toward the boys. "Well?" Ryan was the first to step forward. He cleared his throat, though his voice wavered when he spoke. "Amara, I'm really sorry for what happened. For pushing you, and for everything we said. It was wrong." Amara didn't look at him at first. She stared at her hands, her knuckles white. When she finally glanced up, Ryan's face was red with shame. Mason stepped forward next, shuffling his feet. "Yeah, we were stupid. I'm sorry too. We didn't think about how it would make you feel." One by one, Tyler and Kyle echoed the same sentiments, their voices low and awkward. Amara listened quietly, her heart pounding in her chest. These were the same boys who had laughed as they circled her in the park, who had thrown her books into the dirt. Seeing them now, small and unsure, it was almost hard to believe they were the same people. When the last apology was spoken, the room fell silent. The parents, standing stiffly behind their sons, offered murmurs of approval, but James wasn't finished yet. "You boys hear what you're saying?" James asked, his voice calm but firm. "Apologies don't mean anything unless you learn from this. You don't get to treat people like they're less than you and walk away like it never happened. You need to carry this with you, remember it, and be better." The boys nodded quickly, their faces downcast. Amara finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I hope you mean it," she said, looking directly at Ryan, "because I'm not going to be scared of you anymore." Ryan blinked, surprised by her words, and nodded. "We do mean it." "Good," Amara said quietly. James let the silence settle before he gestured toward the door. "That's enough for now. You can go." The boys filed out one by one, their parents offering quick apologies before following. When the door finally closed behind them, the house felt still again. Amara exhaled a shaky breath and looked up at her father. "Did I do okay?" James smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "You did more than okay, baby. You were brave." Amara nodded, but there was a glimmer of something in her expression. Relief, perhaps, or a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. James knelt down beside her chair, taking her hand in his. "You're stronger than they'll ever know, Amara. Don't ever forget that." She gave him a small smile, and for the first time since that terrible day in the park, she felt something shift deep inside her. The weight she'd been carrying didn't disappear entirely, but it felt lighter, like she could breathe again. That night, Amara lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. She replayed the apologies in her mind, hearing the words again and again. Her father had been right. This was for her. They couldn't undo what had happened, but they had been made to see her, to understand the harm they caused. And she knew that if they ever crossed the line again, her father would be there, just as he had been that day in Dawson Park. Amara closed her eyes and smiled softly. She wasn't afraid anymore. Days passed after the boys' apologies. For Amara, life didn't return to normal immediately, but something had shifted. Walking through the halls of Oak Ridge Middle School, she could feel the stares, some curious, others guilty, and a few even admiring. People had heard what happened. News traveled fast in a small town, and her father's actions had become the stuff of whispers. "She's the one those boys messed with," Amara overheard a girl whisper as she passed. "And her dad made them apologize, in front of her," another added. Amara kept walking, her chin slightly higher than before. A part of her felt exposed, like everyone knew a secret about her. But another part, one she didn't yet recognize, felt proud. At home, James watched his daughter carefully. She was quieter than usual, but there was a steadiness to her now, a quiet strength growing with each passing day. Still, he knew the experience hadn't fully left her. Things like that didn't just fade. One evening after dinner, as the sun set over Oakridge, James found Amara sitting on the back porch, her knees tucked up to her chest. He grabbed a blanket and draped it over her shoulders before sitting beside her. "Hey, baby girl," he said softly. "Mind some company?" Amara shook her head, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "No." They sat together in silence for a moment, the cool breeze brushing against their faces. Finally, Amara spoke. "Daddy, do you think they really meant it when they said they were sorry?" James sighed, considering his words carefully. "I think some of them did, and some of them didn't know how to mean it yet." Amara looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "What do you mean?" "I mean, sometimes people say the words because they're scared, or because someone tells them to. But real change?" James looked at her, his voice soft but firm. "That takes time. It takes making better choices every day until you're a different person." Amara nodded, thinking it over. "So what if they don't change? What if they do it to someone else?" James's jaw tightened. "Then someone like me will step in again. People like that always meet someone stronger, someone who won't let them win." Amara nodded slowly, feeling comfort in her father's words. "I still think about it sometimes, how scared I was." "That's normal," James said. "You went through something hard. But look at you now. You're still here. You're stronger than they are, Amara, because you didn't let what happened break you." Amara blinked back tears, her voice small. "I just don't want to feel scared anymore." James wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You don't have to be scared. You've got me, and I'll always be here for you." Amara leaned into her father's embrace, closing her eyes. For the first time in days, the fear in her chest loosened its grip. The boy's burden. Meanwhile, across town, the four boys who had terrorized Amara were dealing with the weight of their choices. At Ryan Talbot's house, things weren't going well. Ryan's parents hadn't let him off easy after James's visit. His father, a stern man who rarely raised his voice, had made his disappointment clear. "You embarrassed this family," his father said, pacing the living room. "You think it's funny to pick on a little girl? What kind of man are you going to grow into if this is how you act?" Ryan sat slouched on the couch, his face burning with shame. "I said I was sorry," he mumbled. "Sorry isn't enough," his father thundered. "You think you can just say the words and move on?" Ryan flinched but said nothing. Deep down, he knew his father was right. Seeing Amara sitting there, listening to his apology with quiet dignity, had shaken something loose in him. He hadn't expected her to be so strong. He hadn't expected to feel so small. "Go to your room," his father said finally, "and don't come out until you've thought long and hard about what kind of man you want to be." At Mason Green's house, things weren't much better. Mason sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor as his mother's disappointed voice carried from the hallway. "Your father and I didn't raise you to treat people like that, Mason. What if it were your sister? Would you want someone to make her feel the way you made that little girl feel?" "No," Mason muttered, shame tightening his chest. "Then you need to think about what you did," his mother said. "Because this isn't who you are. I know it isn't." Mason wasn't sure who he was anymore. The whole thing had started as a joke, stupid teasing. But standing there in Amara's house, facing her father, he realized it wasn't funny at all. It never had been. Kyle Bennett and Tyler Rowe were dealing with their own guilt. For Tyler, the confrontation at the skate park had left him shaken. He'd always acted tougher than he was, hanging out with kids like Ryan and Mason because it made him feel important. But when James Bennett stood over him, Tyler felt like a child, weak, exposed, and ashamed. At Kyle's house, his father had made him apologize again, this time to his younger sister, just to drive the lesson home. "You need to understand what you did, Kyle," his father said sternly. "You broke someone's trust. You need to fix yourself before you think you can fix anything else." Kyle hadn't said a word. He just nodded and went to his room, guilt gnawing at him. Strength in community. A week later, James and Amara were at the grocery store when something unexpected happened. As they moved down an aisle, Ryan Talbot appeared at the other end. Amara froze, her grip on the shopping cart tightening. But instead of ignoring her or walking away, Ryan looked directly at Amara and nodded. "Hey." Amara blinked, surprised. "Hi," she said softly. Ryan hesitated, then added, "I meant what I said. I'm sorry." Amara studied his face. He looked different. Not cocky or cruel, but sincere. She nodded. "Okay." Ryan gave her a small, almost shy smile before walking past them. James watched the exchange silently, pride swelling in his chest. "You okay, baby girl?" he asked, after Ryan disappeared. Amara nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "Yeah, I think I am." On the quiet victory. That night, as Amara sat at the kitchen table doing her homework, James watched her from the doorway. She looked more at ease than she had in days, humming softly to herself as she scribbled in her notebook. James smiled to himself. The boys might not all change overnight, but seeds had been planted. Amara had stood her ground, and the fear that once shadowed her face was beginning to fade. In that moment, James realized something profound. Strength wasn't always about fists or fury. Sometimes it was about standing firm in the face of darkness, refusing to let it win. And Amara, his brave, beautiful girl, had done exactly that. The chill of early November had settled over Oak Ridge. The trees stood bare, their fallen leaves scattered across sidewalks like forgotten memories. Amara Bennett walked briskly through the schoolyard, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. She wasn't hiding anymore. Her steps were steady, her head held high. The apologies from the boys hadn't erased the pain, but they had given her something she hadn't realized she needed: closure. Yet, not everything had been resolved. Amara's heart still clenched when she saw Ryan Talbot, Mason Green, Tyler Rowe, or Kyle Bennett. They hadn't bothered her since that day at her house, but the uneasiness remained. The world had felt safe once, and now it felt different, like she had to test the ground before trusting it again. As she reached the classroom door, she paused. There, just inside, were Ryan and Mason, leaning against the wall, talking in low voices. Mason noticed her first. His gaze flickered toward her, and then he looked away quickly, as if embarrassed. Ryan, however, straightened. "Hey, Amara," he said. It wasn't loud or forced, just a quiet acknowledgement. Amara hesitated, then nodded. "Hey." Ryan stepped toward her, rubbing the back of his neck. "Listen, I'm trying to join the school's community service program. Coach says it'll help me stay on track. I didn't know if maybe you'd want to do it too?" Amara stared at him, surprised. "Why?" Ryan sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Because I've been a jerk, and I figured it's time I try to do something better, you know?" He glanced at her, his blue eyes uncertain. "It doesn't fix what happened, but—" Amara looked at him for a long moment. She wasn't sure how to respond. The boy who had shoved her, called her names, and laughed with his friends was now standing there, awkward, uncertain, but honest. "I'll think about it," she said quietly. Ryan nodded. "Okay. Cool. Thanks." He turned and walked back to Mason, leaving Amara feeling something unfamiliar. Hope. New steps. That evening, Amara sat at the kitchen table with her father, James, as they ate dinner. The warm glow of the overhead light softened the room's edges, making it feel safe. "Ryan asked me to join some community service thing at school," Amara said suddenly. James paused mid-bite, his fork hovering over his plate. "Ryan Talbot?" Amara nodded. "Yeah? He said he's trying to make better choices. I think he wants to fix things." James leaned back in his chair, studying his daughter's face. "And how do you feel about that?" "I don't know," Amara admitted. "It's weird, but it's kind of nice too. Like maybe he's changing." James considered her words. "People can change, Amara, but it takes time and effort. If he's trying, that's a good thing. Just remember, you don't owe him anything." "I know," Amara said softly, "but maybe if I see him trying, it'll help me stop being so mad about what happened." James smiled faintly. "That's your choice to make, sweetheart. And whatever you decide, I'm proud of you." Amara felt her heart swell. "Thanks, Daddy." A new beginning. 2 days later, Amara found herself standing outside the school gymnasium, where the first meeting of the community service program was being held. She clutched her backpack straps nervously, wondering if she was making a mistake. "You coming in?" a voice said behind her. Amara turned to see Mason Green standing there, hands stuffed into his hoodie pockets. He looked as unsure as she felt. "You're doing this too?" she asked. Mason shrugged. "Yeah, my mom thought it'd be good for me." Guess she was right. They stood there for a moment, in awkward silence, before Amara nodded toward the door. "Let's go then." Inside, the gym was buzzing with activity. Tables were set up with flyers, and a group of students milled about, chatting with teachers and volunteers. Amara spotted Ryan across the room, helping a younger boy organize a pile of canned food for a food drive. He glanced up, caught Amara's eye, and gave her a small nod. Mason muttered beside her, "He's really trying, huh?" "I think so," Amara said. Before she knew it, she and Mason were sorting supplies alongside the others. At first, it felt strange, like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. But as the minutes passed, Amara realized something surprising. Mason wasn't acting like the boy from Dawson Park. He was quiet but helpful, focused on the task at hand. When Mason handed her a box of supplies, he hesitated. "Hey, Amara." "Yeah?" "I really am sorry. I know we said it before, but I mean it. I was just trying to act cool around the guys and it was stupid. You didn't deserve it." Amara looked at him, her heart beating fast. She could see the truth in his eyes. The guilt, the regret, and the awkwardness of trying to make things right. "Thanks, Mason," she said softly. He gave her a small, relieved smile before going back to sorting supplies. That's our healing. Over the next few weeks, Amara kept showing up to the community service program. She worked side by side with Ryan, Mason, Tyler, and other students she barely knew. It wasn't easy. There were still days when she felt unsure, when the memories of that day crept back into her mind. But slowly, the tension began to lift. One afternoon, as the group finished setting up a donation table outside the local grocery store, Ryan wiped sweat from his brow and turned to Amara. "You're pretty good at this," he said. Amara raised an eyebrow. "You sound surprised." Ryan laughed awkwardly. "I just mean, you're a lot stronger than I thought." Amara stared at him, her expression serious. "You didn't think I was strong before?" Ryan shook his head quickly. "No, I mean, you are. I just didn't see it back then." He looked down, his voice quiet. "I was stupid, Amara. I get that now." Amara's lips twitched into a small smile. At least you're not stupid anymore. Ryan blinked, then laughed softly. Fair enough. With a lesson. At home that evening, Amara sat with her father on the porch, the last light of day fading into dusk. How was it today? James asked. Amara smiled faintly. Good. I think they really are trying to change. James nodded, his gaze thoughtful. That's the thing about life, baby girl. People can surprise you, sometimes in bad ways, but sometimes in good ones too. You just have to decide who you let into your world. Amara leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his presence. I think I'm figuring that out. James kissed the top of her head. You've got a good heart, Amara. Don't let anyone take that from you. As the stars began to dot the sky, Amara closed her eyes, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Winter settled over Oak Ridge like a soft, heavy blanket. Snowflakes swirled lazily through the crisp air, dusting the ground in a thin layer of white. Christmas lights glowed softly in windows, and the smell of wood smoke from chimneys lingered on the breeze. Life seemed quieter, softer, yet beneath the surface there was movement, change. Amara Bennett had become a quiet symbol of strength in her small town. At school, she noticed the way things had shifted. Where kids once whispered about her, they now spoke to her with more care. She no longer felt like an outsider to her own life. A surprise encounter. One icy afternoon, Amara lingered after school, waiting for her father to pick her up. Snow crunched under her boots as she stood at the edge of the parking lot. Her breath fogged the air, and she tucked her hands deep into her coat pockets. Hey, Amara! The voice made her jump slightly, but when she turned, she saw Tyler Rowe standing nearby. His skateboard was tucked under one arm, his breath ragged from the cold. Hi, Tyler, Amara said cautiously. Tyler gave a small, lopsided grin. You waiting for your dad? Yeah, she replied, glancing down the road for the familiar sight of James's truck. Tyler kicked at a pile of snow with his boot, clearly fidgeting. You're still doing that community thing, huh? Amara nodded. Yeah, you? Tyler shrugged, rubbing the back of his neck. Sometimes. It's kind of lame, but… He trailed off, his face uncertain. My mom said it's good for me to, do something better. I don't know. It's hard, Amara tilted her head slightly. What's hard? Tyler sighed. Not being like I was. Being the guy who did stupid stuff. Everyone thinks I'm a screw-up. Sometimes I think they're right. Amara looked at him for a long moment. Tyler was wiry, awkward, and a little lost, but he was trying. She could see it. You don't have to be who people say you are, she said softly. You can be better, if you want to be. Tyler blinked, as if her words caught him off guard. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess you're right. He shifted his weight, looking down. Hey, I didn't really say this before, not to you, but I'm sorry, Amara. For all of it. Amara felt a warmth in her chest, unexpected and unexplainable. Thanks, Tyler, she said gently. Tyler's face brightened a little. Yeah, okay, see you around. He gave a small wave before shuffling off down the sidewalk, his breath forming small clouds in the cold. As Amara watched him go, she felt something loosen inside her. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a start. People could change. Tyler was proof of that. Fathers and sons. Meanwhile, James Bennett was beginning to see the ripples of his actions in the community. One evening, he stopped by the local hardware store to pick up supplies. As he browsed the shelves, a familiar voice called out, Mr. Bennett? James turned and saw Ryan Talbot's father, Alan, standing near the paint cans. Alan was a big man with tired eyes and the kind of posture that suggested a life of hard work. Alan, James greeted, his voice even. Alan shifted awkwardly, clearly searching for words. "Wanted to thank you," he said finally. "For what you did?" James raised an eyebrow. "For what I did?" Alan nodded. "Ryan needed a wake-up call, and you gave him one. He's been different these past few weeks, more responsible, even signed up for that community service thing at school. Says it was your daughter who convinced him to stick with it." James's expression softened slightly. "That's good to hear. Kids need guidance. Sometimes they just need someone to hold them accountable." Alan nodded again, his face serious. "You've got a strong girl, James. And you're a good man. I should have stepped in sooner with Ryan, but I didn't see it. Not until you did." James looked at Alan, sensing the guilt behind his words. "We all make mistakes," James said quietly. "It's what we do after that matters." Alan extended his hand. "Thank you." James shook it firmly. "Take care of your boy, Alan. Make sure he keeps walking the right path." "I will," Alan promised. As James left the hardware store, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of peace. The world wasn't perfect. There were still struggles, still wrongs, but little by little, people were trying to be better. The gift of forgiveness. The week before Christmas, the community service group gathered to deliver donations to families in need. Amara and her father joined the volunteers, loading boxes of food, toys, and warm clothes into cars. Amara worked alongside Ryan, Mason, and Tyler, their movements easy now, the tension of the past slowly fading away. When Mason handed her a box of canned goods, he offered a smile. "Bet you didn't think we'd ever be doing this together, huh?" he joked. Amara shook her head, smiling faintly. "No, but I'm glad we are." Ryan walked over, his hands full of coats. "Hey, Amara," he said, his tone quieter. "We're all heading to the cafe after this, just to hang out. You should come." Amara hesitated, glancing toward her father, who was watching her with a knowing look. "You can go if you want," James said, walking over. "I'll wait here and help clean up." Amara nodded, surprised at how natural it felt to say, "Okay, I'll go." As she followed Ryan and the others toward the cafe, Amara realized something profound. She wasn't scared of them anymore. They weren't the same boys who had laughed and jeered at her. They were different now, because they had chosen to be, and so had she. A quiet resolution. That evening, as Amara and her father sat by the fire with hot cocoa in their hands, James looked at her with quiet pride. "You're not just strong, Amara. You're brave," he said softly. Amara looked up at him, smiling. "You taught me that, Daddy." James shook his head. "No, baby girl, you taught yourself." Amara leaned back into the couch, feeling warm and safe. The past couldn't be erased, but it didn't define her anymore. The fear, the anger, they didn't own her. As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, James glanced out the window. Snow fell gently over Oak Ridge, blanketing the town in white. Outside, life moved forward, slowly, steadily, just like Amara. Winter tightened its grip on Oak Ridge, but in the Bennett home, there was warmth. The Christmas tree stood proudly in the corner of the living room, its twinkling lights casting a soft glow across the walls. Ornaments, some old and handmade, dangled from its branches, each carrying a memory. Amara Bennett sat cross-legged on the carpet, tying a ribbon around a small gift. She hummed to herself softly, a tune her father often played on the radio. From the kitchen, James Bennett watched his daughter with quiet pride. It had been months since that terrible day in Dawson Park, but Amara had grown, not just taller or older, but stronger. He could see it in her eyes now, the way they held confidence and understanding far beyond her years. "Need any help there, Elf?" James asked, stepping into the room with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. Amara grinned up at him. "I've got it, Santa." She finished the bow and held up the small package. "This one's for Mrs. Lawson across the street." "The woman who always brings those pies we don't need?" James teased, handing her a mug. Amara laughed. "Those pies are good, Dad." James settled onto the couch, sipping his drink, his eyes never leaving his daughter. She was smiling. Truly smiling. And he realized it was the first time in months that the shadows of Dawson Park seemed to have completely left her. "You've been busy with the community program," James said casually. Amara nodded, her face glowing with pride. "Yeah, we finished the food drive last week. Now we're collecting blankets and jackets for families who need them. It feels good to help people." James smiled, his heart swelling. "I'm proud of you, Amara." "Thanks, Daddy," Amara said softly, but then her expression turned thoughtful. "I saw Ryan at school today." James raised an eyebrow. "How'd that go?" "It was fine," Amara replied. "He asked how I was doing. He seemed different, like he's still trying." James leaned back, his voice calm. "People can surprise you, sweetheart. Sometimes for the worse, but sometimes for the better." Amara nodded. "Yeah, I think he's trying to be better. Mason, too. Even Tyler." She paused, looking down at her mug. "I don't think I'll ever be friends with them, but I don't feel mad at them anymore. Not like I did." James set his mug on the table and leaned forward. "That's forgiveness, Amara. It doesn't mean you forget what happened. It means you're letting go of the anger so it doesn't weigh you down anymore." Amara looked up at him, her eyes wide and thoughtful. "Did you ever have to forgive someone like that?" James was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window where snow was beginning to fall again. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice low. "When I was younger, there were people who thought I didn't belong, people who tried to tear me down. I carried that anger for a long time." "What happened?" Amara asked softly. James looked back at her, his expression warm. "I met your mom, and then I met you. I realized that holding on to hate meant I was carrying their weight, not mine. So I let it go." Amara smiled faintly. "I think I'm learning that too." The holiday gathering. On Christmas Eve, the community center buzzed with activity. The volunteers from the service program had organized a holiday dinner for families who needed a warm meal and company during the holidays. Tables were set with paper tablecloths and mismatched decorations, and the smell of roasted turkey and baked pies filled the air. Amara moved among the tables, refilling water pitchers and chatting with people as they ate. She wore a red sweater and a Santa hat, her smile easy and bright. It wasn't the same girl who had once been afraid to walk through Dawson Park. She felt different now, lighter, stronger, and part of something bigger. Across the room, she spotted Ryan Talbot helping an elderly man carry a plate of food. Mason and Tyler were setting out extra chairs for a family that had just arrived, and even Kyle Bennett, who still mostly kept to himself, was handing out cookies to kids. Amara watched them for a moment, a small smile tugging at her lips. They had been the source of so much pain, but here they were, choosing to be better. It didn't erase what had happened, but it was enough for now. Ryan caught her eye and gave her a quick wave, his expression shy. Amara waved back, her heart calm and steady. Coming home. Later that evening, as Amara and James walked home through the quiet snow-covered streets, the town felt different, like it was sleeping peacefully under the weight of the season. Amara's cheeks were pink from the cold, and her breath turned to mist as she spoke. "Daddy, do you think people like Ryan and Mason will stay good, or will they mess up again?" James glanced down at her, smiling faintly. "I think they'll try. And that's all any of us can do, Amara. We try, we learn, and when we mess up, we fix it." Amara nodded, thoughtful. "I hope they do." "They're lucky they had someone to remind them what's right," James said, draping an arm over his daughter's shoulder. "Not everyone gets that chance." They reached the front porch, and James paused to look out at the quiet street. Snowflakes landed softly on his jacket, but he barely noticed. "You know what I'm proud of most?" What? Amara asked. That you stood tall. You forgave, but you didn't let anyone take away your strength. Amara smiled up at her father. You taught me that, Daddy. James chuckled softly, his deep voice warm. Maybe, but you lived it. On the final light. That night, Amara lay in bed, watching the snowflakes swirl beyond her window. Her heart felt peaceful. She thought about Dawson Park, about the way those boys had once made her feel powerless. She thought about how her father had come for her, how he'd shown her that she wasn't alone. And she thought about the boys now, different, trying, choosing. She didn't forgive them for them. She forgave them for herself. As Amara drifted off to sleep, she whispered softly into the quiet, "Thank you, Daddy." And somewhere in the next room, James Bennett sat quietly, feeling like the proudest father in the world. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering Oak Ridge in white, a symbol of new beginnings, second chances, and the strength it takes to move forward.